So with United 93, we finally get to 9/11, and I think the first question to start with then is, where were you when you first heard about it? And obviously would have been grade school, but just like exactly when and where and how that kind of played out for you.
I was 8 years old, so I was in third grade, and I don't really remember that much about the actual day. I mean, you probably have a way better memory of it than I do. I remember being like in class, and like one of the other teachers came into our class and said, oh, there's been a attack on New York or something. And I don't remember. I have a memory of watching like TV news, but I don't know if that's a real memory or I'm just putting that back in my head from just seeing, news footage of 9/11 so many times over the years. But yeah, I remember going home after school, and my dad was in the National Guard at the time. So he was like, he had come home early from his other job, was like getting all of his stuff to go to McConnell, because like every base was like on, the highest force protection condition possible. And I think he was actually gone for like a few days. Like he was like sleeping in his office and stuff there. But yeah, I don't remember too much about it. And I didn't really know. I don't think I really even was familiar with like what the World Trade Center was or what the Pentagon was when I was that age.
True.
I'd almost certainly seen pictures of the New York City skyline, but I didn't know that those two towers that was what that was.
Well, I think I was even only peripherally aware of what they were too. I just, are those the two tall ones? Or you hear about the Empire State Building? So yeah, I probably didn't even, at 21 years old or whatever, didn't necessarily even know that either.
Yeah, and I certainly wasn't old enough to understand like the impact or the
ramifications.
The ramifications of what exactly was going on, or the severity of what exactly was going on. Because I was an 8-year-old kid, so
right. Yeah, for me the equivalent at that time would have been, I was probably about third, fourth grade when the Challenger space shuttle exploded.
Sure.
And even then, just kind of only being, again, peripherally aware of what a big deal it was.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's horrible, but like you
have
no frame of reference.
You have like a distinct, memory and a distinct experience with like pre 9/11 America.
Oh,
whereas for me, like,
right.
yes, I have memories that are pre 9/11, but I didn't really experience.
They're not the context of pre 9/11, right?
Exactly. I didn't experience necessarily a pre 9/11 America because I was 8 years old when it happened. So basically all of any formative experience or memory that I've had has been in a post 9/11 America.
Right. Interesting.
And that kind of goes to show like exactly how, important this kind of moment in history. I mean, it's a very distinct split. It's almost like a modern BC AD split.
That's a good way to put it. And I think I've been thinking similar thoughts heading into this episode, and that's probably a better way to put it that I had come up with. Because it's beyond just the attack in the United States, obviously. It's a worldwide split as far as before and then after, and just kind of an eye-opening thing of, obviously there have been terrorist attacks before and since, and this one just kind of, I think just the shock value and the magnitude was just eye-opening to the whole world, even those. Keep in mind, it's obviously just a small group that were in support of this happening, but even changing their worlds as well. For me, I was in my final semester at Wichita State, but I must not have had class till later, or I think it was a Tuesday, right? I don't think I even had classes maybe that day, but either way, I was still asleep because I was a college kid.
Yeah, because I mean, and that was the other thing too, is I have memory, like. It's hard to kind of differentiate, like, did I really experience this, or is this just like seeping into my memory from other sources? But I think it would have had to have been early in the morning, because it was I think the first plane.
Well, we see that in the movie here that it's early in the morning.
Yeah. But and even with the time change, so the United States, the Central Time Zone would have been
an hour behind. Yeah,
an hour behind, and I think the first plane hits at just about, it was like 8:30 New York time, so it would have been like 7:30 or quarter to 8. So yeah, but I mean, obviously it was well after that before anybody knew it was going on. But yeah, I do remember it being like an early morning thing.
So what's interesting too is, so my mom must have, I don't know if she had first block planning period or something, but so it was, right around 9 a.m. Central, give or take. And so she had actually, school had already started for the high school. She had run back home. This was kind of becoming a thing in the news. She wakes me up, and I'm pretty sure she said, hey, we're under attack. Something just hit New York City or whatever it was. So, and then I turn on the news, and I think for the longest time, I remember seeing the video of the second plane hitting, and then in my mind, I didn't know if I was actually seeing it live, and they were showing the smoldering first building, and I saw a live second building hit. And for a while, I thought that was possible. But the fact that my mom said we're under attack, and then you combine with what we see in the movie here, that probably wasn't known enough yet. So it was probably a replay.
Right. It wasn't until the second plane hit that people kind of knew what was going on, because after when the first plane hit, it was being covered like it was an accident.
Correct. Although, man, timeline wise though, if the second plane was at 9:28 Central, man, if I did see it not live, and maybe my mom was wrong. Maybe she did, you know what I'm saying? So it is still possible, I guess, if, my mom didn't understand what was going on and just said, I don't know. Again, your memories become vague, and what was the actual memory, and what have you inserted into your memory after the fact?
Right. And how many times have we seen 9/11 footage over the year? I mean, definitely every anniversary they are always showing footage, but then countless times, in movies and just, living in the United States after 9/11, you see that footage all the time. And then also that day in particular, they're showing footage of the second plane hitting over and over again and replaying it and showing everything from different angles. And so, yeah, I mean, how much is our actual memory and how much is just like inserted stuff?
And in my cynical college view at the time, when it basically almost immediately got branded 9/11, maybe in the following year, but I remember thinking that, I don't want to say overblown, but just the idea that, so something like Pearl Harbor, we still would recognize, decades after the fact. And for some reason in my mind, again, probably still being in my early 20s, I still lack the context to realize that this was that big a deal, that it would get named and have this lasting cultural and worldwide and historic impact versus just being an event. And obviously, crappy things happen all the time, and I didn't, why did this cross the threshold? And in my mind, I was a little cynical that it needed to be named in such a way.
Yeah.
But here we are, 19 years later, and no, obviously, and then you also look at the numbers. There was more people killed on 9/11 than at the Pearl Harbor attacks. So yes, it was a bigger attack. So of course it's going to have the staying power historically, and to the point now that how many people can even name the date of the Pearl Harbor attacks? I mean, I'm sure you can, but as far as the general population goes, it's a little harder to do. Of course, they weren't named after their date, which does make it trickier, I guess, even if you are aware of them.
But even that it's framed in the context of the bigger world event of World War II, whereas this stands on its own as this hugely influential day.
Right, and it did lead to other conflicts, but those conflicts don't have the worldwide weight of the Second World War.
And it's almost the opposite. So Pearl Harbor is framed as like as this beginning, this inciting incident to the overall event of World War II, whereas the global war on terrorism, war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq are framed as just like aftermath events following 9/11.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting, that kind of dichotomy there. Now, so the film itself, I thought, takes a very interesting approach, and I'd be curious how it holds up, but I'd be curious how it would be viewed by someone, say, several decades in the future from now who doesn't have the context of what's going on. It's almost like it kind of assumes the audience is aware of the September 11th attacks, obviously.
Well, I think some historical events, maybe that's a kind of a reach, but I don't think it is for this movie.
Oh, definitely not now. I'm just curious, say, 80 years from now, does it hold up as well? Or I'm sure you'd still educate yourself and you would still understand, I guess, by the end. But at the beginning, you'd probably be more confused. But I think it's still compelling. That's kind of my point. Is I think it will hold up, and then I do think it'd be compelling, even if you were a little confused at first, 80 years from now, watching this. And the point of view is very interesting too. So, kind of cut ahead here. So, the United 93 is the flight that did not hit its target on 9/11 because the passengers basically were able to not necessarily overpower completely, but cause enough havoc within the plane to make it crash prematurely in a field, so where only the people on the plane were killed.
And it was kind of like it's almost like a bridge too far moment for the hijackers, because the rest of the airplanes are able to be hijacked before anyone really knows what's going on. But I mean, we're talking it's 9:30 in the morning when United 93 is hijacked, and American Flight 77 crashes into the Pentagon at 9:37. So it basically, the final aircraft that actually reaches its target is crashing at the same time that this flight is being just hijacked. So it's almost like
with an hour to go, right?
And so everyone's able to kind of get information and figure out that, okay, this is part of a bigger overall thing. And because before this, pretty much any aircraft hijacking was done, terrorists would hijack the plane, will release these hostages in exchange for insert demand here. We saw this in Munich when we talked about Munich. After the Munich attacks, there was a Lufthansa flight that was hijacked, and they released the crew in exchange for getting the Munich attackers released. So that's, that kind of played a significant role in the people on these flights likely had no idea. Well, they definitely didn't have any idea what was about to happen, but they probably didn't even consider that the hijackers were going to use the aircraft itself as a weapon versus, hey, if we just stay calm and don't aggravate the situation at all, maybe we'll get let go eventually, or the authorities are going to storm the plane, we'll be fine.
That's a good point, how it was basically two existing forms of terrorism that people were aware of. Suicide bombings were already a thing, and hijackings were already a thing. But it never crossed anyone's mind that they would be combined and they would hijack a plane to turn it into the suicide bomb.
Right.
And the fact that there was the delays on United 93 are basically what prevented it from ultimately hitting its target as well, because they would have had that same, plausible deniability, or there's probably better ways to say that. But basically, the passengers would be hopeful in a way that they lost once they started hearing what had happened to the other planes. And they knew that their only chance was to land it themselves and try to take over. And I think in my mind initially too, even having seen this movie before, I think I kind of thought they hit the point where we know for sure we're dead, so we might as well make sure these guys don't accomplish their goal. It's no, they still had some hope that no, if we can take, these guys are trying to kill themselves with the plane and us on it, but if we can get them out of the cockpit, we have a chance to land it and live.
Yeah. Because there was one guy who was who was a pilot. There was another guy who was had spent time as an air traffic control guy. So they had enough altitude and enough time to actually get control of the aircraft, they might have actually been okay. And it's extra shitty watching this movie because it's a true story, and you know exactly how the story ends. But I don't know if it's just me personally having this wishful thinking watching, because I've seen this movie several times, but every time I watch it, it's you still have that little bit of oh man, maybe they're gonna make it this time, maybe they're gonna be able to carry out their plan and succeed. And obviously it's going in that they're not, but
because it's made like so many other movies that's the exact plot, and you'll even kind of talk about in this movie, why did the heroes always win or whatever? It's because they don't make movies about the stories that don't end that way. And here's an example where they did, and it's tragic. I mean, basically it's Apollo 13 if the shuttle blows up. I mean, it's just it takes you through all those same beats of here's how we're going to win the day, and they don't win the day, and just tragic beyond belief. But again, as far as perspective goes, I do think it's an interesting way to look at the 9/11 attacks, because you only see a few different parallel or I don't know, like settings, I guess. So you have the plane itself, and then you have basically all the different levels of air traffic control and military response, but you never go to the other planes.
Right.
You never go to politicians, really. It's all just the air traffic control in the different places and the military, specifically the military, like the Air Force, who can put the planes in the air, get the jets in the air to do something about it.
Yeah.
And that's it.
And it's such a different story dynamic following it from this point of view, because there's obviously other 9/11 movies. Did you watch the miniseries, The Looming Tower?
No, I haven't.
With Jeff Daniels.
I have not seen that.
So it's based on a book. It's actually it's a really good book. It basically goes all the way back to like the 1940s. It helps you understand kind of like the formation of Al Qaeda itself, and then goes into the lead up to 9/11. So it's based on that book, but it follows FBI and CIA intelligence guys and like them trying to combat Al Qaeda and kind of figure out what their plans are. And so in that movie 9/11, it happens and you're like, oh man, like they saw it coming the whole time, and it's like this major like personal failure moment for all the characters. But when you look at it from the point of view that United 93 does, no one knows anything about what's going on.
That's almost the theme of the movie, is how disconnected all these agencies are. And it's like, if they could just communicate better, maybe we could, maybe not stop this, but man, this response is just a mess because no one knows what's going on with the other agencies.
And you see it a ton of times. So like they first basically figure out that American 11 might have been hijacked, and then there's the plane crash into the World Trade Center, the North Tower, and they don't immediately connect those dots right away. And then the second plane hits, and they say, okay, this is probably this plane and this plane that we lost contact with. That's probably those two flights. But then like 15 minutes later, like, no, that American Flight 11, yeah, someone made contact with that plane. That plane's still up in the air. They're like, whoa, well, then what plane hit this tower? And then there's the whole thing about when they initially scrambled the fighter jets, basically pre 9/11, if you are scrambling fighter jets, it's to, deal with some threat coming from over the ocean. So they like immediately just started going east. And the guy's like, why are they going east? He said, well, that's their default heading. That's where they go when you scramble them.
Over the ocean, right.
Right. And just, so situations like that throughout the whole, just this, it's chaos. It's complete chaos.
Which was the goal of the terrorists. I mean, chaos was the goal, both that day, but then obviously, basically, they accomplished their goal. I mean, their goal was our reaction. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not like they were going to win some war against us. It wasn't about that. It was about disruption. I mean, that's what terrorism is. We've talked about it before with, Battle of Algiers and When the Shakes the Barley. I mean, the goal of terrorism is just kind of disruption against the perceived oppressors. It's just kind of weird because we don't see ourselves as Americans as the oppressor. And I want to get into kind of the motivations and Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda and all that. But from their point of view, they were lashing out against the perceived oppressor. And again, we'll get into bin Laden here, I guess, in more detail. But I also thought it was interesting how the movie there's no real point of view character. Even on the flight, you're not following one passenger or... It's almost like, and I don't know, this might sound like super pretentious saying this, but it's almost like they made 9/11 the main character of the movie. That's a good way to put it.
There's no big name actors. There's no protagonist really.
Right.
Even the terrorists, I mean, yeah, they're portrayed as obviously they're the antagonist, but they, it's not like there's like the one big bad guy that they're trying to fight. They're just like, it's almost like they are just the guys that happen to be doing the hijacking, and that's just something that's happening at the same time as all this other stuff that's happening.
Yep. And did you catch that the one was our main guy from Kite Runner?
It was the same. Yeah. I forget the actor's name, but yeah, the main character from Kite Runner is like the lead terrorist on United 93.
So yeah, again, just a solid movie. It's a 90% on Rotten Tomatoes, and very interestingly nominated for 2 Oscars, which again makes sense. It's a solid movie, but for a movie that got a Best Directing nomination, to have only 2 total nominations, that just seems really, really bizarre and unusual to me. And I haven't looked at like every movie to kind of see how rare that is, but I would imagine to get a Best Directing nomination and only one other Oscar nomination has probably not happened much in the last several decades, if at all. I'd be willing to make that bet, I guess. Because no Best Picture nomination, oddly, and it was nominated for film editing, but that directing nomination kind of stands out for a film with so few other nominations.
Yeah. One other thing that I wanted to bring up about the movie itself is I think that it was, and I didn't even know this like the first couple times that I watched the movie, but the head FAA guy, Ben Sliney, is playing himself.
Oh, really? He does a really good job then, because he seems like an actor, like in a good way. He doesn't feel out of place.
Apparently, like there's a lot of like a bunch of the FAA guys that you see are all playing themselves, or they're people who are actually FAA officials that are then playing roles of other FAA officials. But so when he walks in and everyone's like applauding him, it was his first day in that job.
I wonder what the applause were for. That's why he was the new boss.
He's like head of operations for FAA. Day one is 9/11.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's true. Like that was real. So he is portraying himself as he was on 9/11, and and then at the end it kind of culminates with his decision to ground every single aircraft, every single flight in the United States.
Which honestly. So yeah, for your first day to make that bold a call and it be the right call, props to him on that. I mean, but again, obviously he had the resume to earn that position in the first place. But you're right. To make that big a decision, and it was the right call.
And the guy that's standing next to him is almost like not really trying to talk him out of it. Yeah, but he's like, that's going to be like hundreds of billions of dollars.
Right.
And the guy's like, we don't have a choice. Like
he's like, we're under attack. We shut it all down.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And and at that point in time, like they didn't know anything other than we have aircraft that are being hijacked. And he points at me. He said, "We're at war with somebody."
Right.
Every flight has to land right now.
Right, because they all could be weapons, and we don't know which one. So just land them all. Don't let anything else take off. Don't let anybody else come into the United States. Which I don't understand on the fuel standpoint. They're basically even saying turn away international flights. So a plane coming from the UAE has to turn around. Like, where does it go? It's going to run out of fuel, isn't it? Or do they all have enough fuel to do that?
I'm not really sure of the logistics of all that. Fair. Obviously, they're not going to let planes crash. I think that they probably divert. You have to divert somewhere, or like you land at whatever. And it wasn't like, oh, I'm flying this 747, so I need to get to the next like international airport that can accommodate the. It's like, no, whatever runway is the closest to you, you are going to land at. Otherwise, we're gonna like shoot you down with fighter planes. There were stories of like huge passenger planes landing in the like tiny little regional airports, and they're having to like bring out air stairs or like fire trucks because they don't have air stairs that are big enough for jets like that. So I mean, it really was this like unprecedented move on the part of the FAA to say that every aircraft that's in the air needs to land at whatever runway they can land at right now.
Well, and that ties into the play I mentioned to you that my mom liked, the Come From Away, about the 9/11 plane that lands in the Canadian Village. And so basically that. I don't know where it was initially intended to land, but it ends up getting diverted to a small town in Canada, even though it was a giant plane, like you said.
I always remember whenever my mom talks about 9/11, when we lived in Cheney, which is a small town west of Wichita, Kansas, for listeners that aren't familiar with Kansas geography.
Don't know us personally, yeah.
Since we're like just west of Wichita, there's a lot of planes flying over that are on approach to the airport. And so, it was like several times a day you'd have planes flying over at relatively low altitudes. I mean, nothing crazy, but just talk about like how those couple weeks after 9/11 when there were no flights, that it was like eerie and kind of weird, but it was like not really a thing you could put your finger on, but it was because there were no airplanes flying over like throughout the entire day.
My aunt and her husband, I forget how soon after it was, but obviously there was that dip in travel. They basically took advantage, and I don't even know if it was weeks or months, but it was not too long after 9/11. They were like, well, let's go to Hawaii. And like, so they're like no one at the airports, like cheap flights, and basically taking
Almost
advantage. Yeah.
exactly like what's going on with like the coronavirus stuff,
Right,
where you can
right.
get like a flight to Miami for like $40 or something.
Right. And yeah, I've been messing with that unsuccessfully myself.
Yeah,
I saw $58 round trip to LA. But again, what are you gonna do when you get there? Like everything's
right.
closed. Right.
Everything's shut down. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, the other interesting dynamic too that I can remember. So I was in college at the time. So the issue for us is we were all of draft age. And so is there going to be a draft was like the talk during 2002 because I would have been of draft age. And there was, friends of mine talking like, okay, if there is a draft and you think you're going to get enlisted, you maybe try to beat them to the punch and sign up. I basically was trying to figure out like the safest, best way to be. And it was like, okay, if you actually go ahead and enlist in the Air Force before you get recruited in the Army or something like that.
Right. Just like, yeah, like World War II, where it's like, hey, you can get drafted, or if you enlist, you can have your choice of service or your choice of job or whatever.
Right. Exactly.
So you're kind of like trying to weigh your odds. Yeah. I didn't even, I mean.
Yeah. You were 8. You didn't have to worry about that.
Right. Yeah.
Although, hey, by the time you joined the Marines, we were still fighting a lot of the same battles.
Yep.
Which we'll get to here in maybe subsequent weeks. But I do want to talk about now kind of the Al-Qaeda side of things and Osama bin Laden. So obviously not long after attacks, Al-Qaeda and bin Laden did basically say, yep, that was us because you guys suck. And I wanted to talk about the motivations, and this kind of tie into what we're going to talk about for probably a few weeks here as we kind of just continue to deal with not specifically 9/11, but obviously the conflicts that follow and just other issues in the Middle East that are kind of all tangentially or directly in some instances related. And so Al-Qaeda was kind of started by bin Laden.
Al-Qaeda was founded in 1988. So it was during the Soviet-Afghan War, and Osama bin Laden was one of the founding members.
Okay, yes. And so I'd always kind of heard that he was, from money, which is true, and was pretty well educated, which is true. And from his point of view, it was basically this whole, why is the U.S. always meddling in the Middle East?
Yeah.
So let's basically fight back against them. Now, at the same time, we became way more radicalized to where even other Muslims who would agree with those things, that the U.S. shouldn't be always meddling in their way of life or whatever, they might agree to that point, but he took it way farther and was totally okay with the killing of civilians, including women and children, as legitimate targets, and that the West is just using them in human shields if they think we can't attack them anyway. He was also, as a strict Muslim, kind of, the quote here is rejecting the immoral acts of fornication, homosexuality, intoxicants, gambling, and usury, is a quote pulled from a statement of bin Laden about the evils of the United States. So there's definitely him viewing the U.S. and Western culture as kind of this hedonist haven that needed to be attacked in the name of God, and that he wanted the U.S. to convert to Islam.
Right, and on top of that, one of his major issues with the United States was the fact that they were buddy-buddy with Saudi Arabia. He didn't like the relationship that the United States had with the Saudis, and he wanted the United States to withdraw any kind of military from there, and wanted the United States to get out of the Middle East, and specifically Saudi Arabia, because that's where he's from.
Right when he got kicked out of Saudi Arabia about the time he was forming Al-Qaeda as well.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, too, how a lot of this all ties into, as well, the first Gulf War and the Iraq-Kuwait situation. So obviously there's the continued decades-long U.S. support for Israel, which is seen as anti-Islamic just because we basically pick sides. And then with the war in Kuwait, with Iraq, how there's just the sanctions and just basically how the treatment of Iraq was seen as maybe beyond what should have been the scope of the Western forces.
Because bin Laden wanted to help the Saudis, like defend Saudi Arabia from Iraq, which Iraq was like looking like they were going to do when they invaded Kuwait. But the king of Saudi Arabia basically told him, like, we don't need your help. We got the U.S. and we got the Western coalition, and that really kind of pissed Saddam Hussein. It did piss Saddam Hussein off because he was on the losing end of that war, but it pissed Osama bin Laden off. He was deeply offended.
Yes, and there's actually a Wikipedia page called Motivations for the 9/11 Attacks, and it does mention things that are not necessarily intuitive and things that, shoot, if anything, the fact that we don't know about them is part of probably what makes Islamic extremists especially angry about the fact that we're just kind of casually ignoring these things. And so it does talk about...
Oh, yeah, and that's something too, which, before I say this, let me make it very clear that I do not condone terrorism, and I do not think that anything that happened in the United States on September 11th was good. However, even if they are not good reasons or legitimate reasons, the people that carried out those attacks had reasons for doing so.
Right. Osama bin Laden doesn't think he's a villain.
Right. And I think that that's something that a lot of people don't understand.
Right. He's not twirling his mustache. He's thinking he's the hero.
Or
he's
they think,
the
well, I just hate America just because they got freedom and stuff.
Right. Or they see that freedom as like, or our interpretation of our freedom, or our manifestation of freedom as, our expression of freedom as against their religious teachings, to the point that it needs to be punished.
Which is ridiculous because there are American Muslims.
Well, no, that's why it's obviously just this extreme sect that was willing to go to these extremes, right?
Yes.
But the different attacks, it kind of mentions it. So it talks about, U.S. intervention in Somalia, which, deals with the Black Hawk Down situation. And the one I didn't hear of here, it talks about something called the Kana Massacre, which does look kind of messed up. Like that basically Israel bombed a UN compound and killed a bunch of civilians and then basically just shrugged it off and had no repercussions. And so, that was in 96. So just kind of an instance that went a long way for helping radicalize. Again, stuff like this happens. That's how Al-Qaeda and organizations like that recruit, is where they see the West doing horrible things without repercussions. And so then someone like bin Laden comes around and he's preaching this stuff. It starts to make sense to them. And yeah, so again, there's multiple things that led to this, even if they are not justifications. They're kind of milestones along the way leading to a 9/11.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also kind of important to include when we talk about 9/11, like all of the stuff that led up to it. Like 9/11 didn't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
There were a ton of other like attacks on United States interests and embassies and stuff. Like they have the Khobar Towers attack.
Even the World Trade Center had been bombed before in the
the World Trade Center was there was a car bomb in the basement of the parking garage in 93. And then, bombings against U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. The USS Cole attack in October of 2000. So there's a lot of smaller attacks leading up to this too that were all Al-Qaeda trying to flex on the United States, basically.
Right, and then let's see. And then, so the one other thing I wanted to mention here, because again, we'll kind of tread some more ground on this stuff later, but comedian Jon Stewart's effort to kind of get restitution, so to speak, for the first responders on 9/11, and that the numbers are kind of crazy, that more first responders have died since 9/11 from health complications than died on the day lending aid. And just, you think about, it's crazy. We kind of know, obviously, say cigarette smoke causes cancer, but I think we underestimated the extent to which basically one day of inhaling a blown up building is almost certainly going to give you cancer and kill you within the next 10 to 15 years. And it's happened to hundreds and hundreds of people.
Right. Think of how hazardous it would be to be on like construction site or like if you're like remodeling your bathroom, right? And you're like knocking down walls or something, the drywall dust, regular dust, insulation, all the things that you would wear a mask. Obviously, you want to keep yourself protected. But imagine 2 skyscrapers worth of that, and you're there, no mask, working for days at a time. All that stuff's in the air.
Right. And then, so Jon Stewart's efforts particularly was addressing the government's failure to basically pay the medical bills for these people. That these, they're now just spending, years of their life in the hospital. They can't work. and they're on their own financially, and it took years, and finally just last summer they finally got it passed.
The argument was that, and I don't think this is a good argument, but the argument was that, well, it's not a federal issue because they're like city employees.
Correct.
So why should the federal government?
Right.
And I think it was like last year in his speech when he's talking about like these people, like the terrorists weren't attacking the city of New York, like they were attacking the United States of America, and these people stepped up to help out other Americans. So the federal government should help them out. There's no reason not to.
Yeah, I think John's line was the terrorists didn't shout death to Tribeca.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, you're right. The feds were basically saying it as well. This is New York. This is New York employees. It's like, but yes, it was an attack on the country. It'd be like if after Pearl Harbor, FDR was just like, on your own, Hawaii.
Yeah.
I mean, it's ridiculous. And just watching clips of Jon Stewart talking about this, and you forget that this dude is a career comedian because he is so passionate about it, and he tears up every time. And I'm getting close right now, but just how he talks about, he did it for so long. He would meet with people and then meet again later, and like the people he had on is kind of like, here's a victim that I'm trying to advocate for. Well, yeah, they were literally dying. So he had 5 guys on one time, and then 5 years later, 2 of those guys are back because the other 3 had died, or 2 had died and 1 was at home and couldn't make it. Like it was rough.
Yeah, and the importance and the impact of it can't be overstated. Like so much stuff changed like forever. Think about going to an airport on September 10th versus September 12th.
Right. And just our whole outlook, our whole worldview.
Other stuff too, like obviously the war that we've been in for almost 20 years now, the Patriot Act, as for like, domestic surveillance, and even like culturally kind of, I think there's a kind of a loss of innocence almost.
To your point, an event that happened when you were 8 years old is the reason when you joined the Marines at how old, you went over to Afghanistan as part of the same mission that started when you were 8 years old. So it's just kind of
right. And
crazy.
it is still going on today. I mean, there's still no Taliban peace deal. There's still no, there's no end in sight really. And that was almost 19 years ago.
Right.
There are literally, people who are fighting in the war in Afghanistan that were not even born on 9/11.
Right. Because they're past 18 now. It's been over 18 years ago, which means those soldiers now could have literally not been born, and that's crazy when you think about a World War II lasting 6 years, even counting before the U.S. was even in it, from September 1st, 39 all the way through the Japanese surrender in August of 45. I mean, you're just under 6 years for World War II. Kind of the end all be all as far as conflicts go. Yeah, it's crazy, and we'll kind of continue dealing with these issues here in future weeks. Next week we're going something that is, I guess, kind of tangentially related, but we're going to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and see things from the point of view of suicide bombers in Paradise Now.